Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the news items we have for you this week, the relationship between fluoride and IQ, a further update to the CDC's report on an increase in abscesses in children's brains, a relationship between cannabis consumption and an increase in fungal infections, the oldest known burial sites may not have been made by humans, how to recycle the key component in diapers, although strangely not talking about the shit within them. And humans have the power to destroy asteroids coming towards Earth. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the relationship between fluoride and IQ. And no, it's not that those who spread conspiracies about fluoride in water are stupid. Rather, there are several, let's call them studies, coming out of China particularly, but other countries as well, that report that higher fluoride levels lead to lower IQ. Now, this sounds like it would be a solid study, but there's a major caveat to this. All of these studies have been, let's say, uncontrolled. That is, to put it less delicately, the fluoride levels were not in any way, shape or form dose dependent. There was no way to establish this is how much fluoride we've given someone and this is the change in IQ. In fact, it's pretty much been whatever fluoride levels were in the water that was consumed is what it was, which does mean that there could be fluctuations on even a day-to-day basis, let alone over the course of the entire individual's lifetime or, more importantly, childhood. So this is the first issue with a lot of these, let's call them studies, although given how uncontrolled they are, calling it that is incredibly generous. Further to this, there are in fact a wide-ranging number of confounding variables, and this is another major problem. That is, if you start to account for fundamental confounding variables for IQ studies, think of things like diet, for instance. If you don't consume a reasonably diverse amount of food on a regular basis, you are going to miss out on some essential nutrients, minerals, and other things for IQ to develop. Then there's issues with education levels, access to more fundamental utilities like, for example, electricity, so that people can, study at night, or at least do something at night time, and the consequential levels of, just comfort. There are these at a minimum, and most studies don't adjust for these confounding variables. Studies that have attempted to do so, and it is somewhat more difficult unless you start getting into the weeds of statistics, have found that no, fluoride doesn't affect IQ. This is one of the major reasons why individual studies, and particularly those that are, to be frank, badly designed, tend to find results, whereas those that are well designed and implemented effectively don't find this. And once you start aggregating the results and segregating them by their, degree of design and reliability, the best designed studies find nothing, the least well designed studies find something, which is generally what happens when you have this kind of meta-analyses. This, of course, is all built on the idea of naturally fluoridated water, that is, water from, say, underground wells or similar. Once you start looking at deliberately fluoridated water, that is what most, conspiracy nutters have access to, there's no effect whatsoever, but that's entirely different in terms of what they're actually talking about. And slightly more importantly, we are talking about the adverse effects when you say no effect whatsoever. The benefits in terms of dental health are significant. Going from, unfounded claims to a well-founded claim and a case study of sorts, and this one may make you squirm uncomfortably, although it could also be a Halloween joke. A Taiwanese woman kept hearing sounds inside her ear, and after 4 days, she finally had enough and decided to see a doctor. The doctor, being an ear, nose and throat specialist, took a look inside her ears and found a spider, a beady-eyed spider that was moving around in her ear, and this is what kept making it sound. along with the molted exoskeletons it had discarded inside of her ear. The reason why the spider likely found its way in there is to find a dark, reasonably comfortable place that it thought it would be protected from when shedding that exoskeleton, and given that it's only about 2.5 millimeters or so in size, which is roughly 1/10 of an inch, it could quite well get into her ear canal, and so it found its way in there and saw to its health and safety, and decided to hang around while its exoskeleton proceeded to set itself up after shedding. Fortunately, removing it was relatively straightforward, but yeah. In further clinical news of a kind, the CDC has issued an update to its earlier report on the unexpected increase in the number of brain abscesses in children. Now, this is not necessarily pandemic levels of increase, but nonetheless it is notable. There was a peak in 2022 of about 102 cases across America, and this was nearly double what the normal baseline would be. The reason this is important is, well, twofold. The first being that these cases generally followed on from respiratory infection, which is a concern, although not necessarily COVID-19, it could have been something like pneumonia. So we're not necessarily attributing it to COVID-19, but it is one of the possible diseases that would contribute. The second is that, well, once you start having these pus-filled pockets exerting pressure on the brain, it tends to go bad, and that's because the brain doesn't like being squished. It is, by its nature, a gelatin-like structure encased in a hard, bony box. Once you start pushing on it from the inside out, it doesn't have anywhere to go, and you begin to crush what is in there. Whether that is blood vessels, preventing the movement of oxygen and therefore hypoxia, or simply crushing the neurons and destroying them that way. In either case, it's not good. Slightly more, let's call it promising news, regards the identification of cells in the human lungs that may be a contributing factor, if not key, to cystic fibrosis. There's a type of cell that's, well, found in the gills of freshwater fish, and for that matter in frogs. This same cell has now been found in human lungs, and this could be an underlying factor when we look at cystic fibrosis, and given that cystic fibrosis is, well, a progressive disease that's based in genetics, and gradually gets worse over the lifetime of the individual, this could be a both target for treatment and possibly a way to, if not prevent it, at least stop it from getting worse. So this discovery, let's be clear about it, is very tentative and very early on, and may instead just be a byproduct of people licking frogs. But if that's not the case, it could prove to be important. The cells in question produce a protein channel, and this protein channel is called the Cystic Fibrosis Transmembrane Conductance Regulator. What it does is it shifts ions out of the cell, and due to osmosis, water follows these ions. In the instances of fish and frogs, this is all well and good. After all, they need that layer of mucus on top of them to protect their body from the environment. In the lungs, not so helpful, given that, well, it makes it very hard to breathe. In the case of the diseased cells that they found in the case of cystic fibrosis, it appears that the small sample they found had a increased rate of reabsorption. Now, to be very clear, the cells in question make up a fractional percentage of the total cells involved in this process. But because these ones increased reabsorption, and this then affected the amount of fluid within the alveoli in particular, but the lungs overall, it is possible that mutated versions doing the decreased reabsorption or increased reabsorption could be disrupting the amount of fluid buildup in the lung, thereby creating not only a degree of confusion within the lung's functionality, but messing with their counterparts, whether you want to consider them the normal counterpart that's meant to exclude these ions, or the newly discovered variant that increases absorption. To be clear though, this is nowhere near clinical study level. This is an observation of phenomena, and without knowing more, it's very hard to see how it's possible to use this information reliably. That contrasts somewhat sharply against the findings that cannabis consumption could be causing an increase in fungal infections, although why exactly isn't so obvious. As a general rule, cannabis consumption has varying degrees of legality, and even where it is illegal, its use is still somewhat prevalent. Although usage is prevalent, and obviously its production is somewhat prevalent as a result, the cannabis plant itself has some quirks in how it grows, and one of those is that it has hundreds of fungi that grow in its roots, stems, leaves, flowers, and the bud that is smoked, or otherwise consumed. These fungi species can in turn produce spores. This is where, well, to be frank about it, a legalization of cannabis consumption could well be leading to an increase in fungal infections, simply because it is more readily available and more readily consumed. As a result, those hundreds of fungi that exist within them could be producing spores that could then be leading to that infection. If not the infection itself, it's entirely possible that the mycotoxins produced by the fungi could be contributing. This is an interesting development, largely because it's something that's not really been considered, let's say. Cannabis is once approved for, let's say, legal consumption, whether it's purely medical or recreational as well, even if it's illegally consumed for that matter. It could well be carrying these fungi, and unlike many other medical products that undergo extremely strenuous quality assurance and quality control, cannabis is generally considered more along the lines of a food product, which is there's not a great deal of testing going into it so long as it's obviously safe. For example, your apples or your pumpkin, your tomato, your potato, all of them, so long as they are obviously safe to eat, will rarely if ever be tested for any concerns, and the same thing goes for most cannabis products, in terms of the cannabis itself. This leads to the relative risk, and that is, if you are a cannabis user, you have a 3.5 times greater chance of developing a fungal infection compared to a non-cannabis user. Of course, the study leading to that was a, let's say, observational study, rather than necessarily being a direct study of cannabis causing it. And so it's possible, if not somewhat likely, that those individuals who were consuming cannabis may have had a range of confounding variables, and these don't appear to have been adjusted for in that figure. That would indicate that, although it could be interesting, it's also not entirely clear how clear those results are. Fungi that were responsible for these infections include Aspergillus, Penicillium, Fusarium, and Mucor, although there were others again. As far as some of these species go, for example Aspergillus, are well-known respiratory pathogens. Going from the purely observational studies to a less substantial, let's say, methodological approach to understanding how diseases spread. In this case, a model of the outbreak of a zombie apocalypse. This is being done in Finland, and so it's no surprise, really. The Finns are known for their alternative takes to many things, but this one is somewhat more useful, and it's very similar to a Canadian study from several years ago. The idea here is that by looking at the spread of zombies across, in this case, just in Finland itself, that the model is able to effectively recreate the outbreak of a zombie, apocalypse, but it's the same fundamental idea as if there was an outbreak of a disease or pandemic, and so they're able to figure out whether or not one zombie, say in the capital city, could spread the disease enough that you would see major issues. In this instance, their findings can be summarized as, if they don't act and deal with it within 7 hours, the entire country would be overrun. Yeah, that's a little bit disconcerting, although what's even more worrying is that those numbers seem to be a lot worse than what the Canadians found a few years ago, with the same fundamental idea. There is, well, 2 major caveats to this research. The first is that the original approach to this was very computationally intensive. That means it's very difficult to do. In order to make up for that rather hard design, they took their initial idea and simplified it. By simplifying the design, and by, frankly, including assumptions and a few other things underlying it, they could run it on a far less powerful system and still give, well, realistic outcomes, but not necessarily as, let's say, well demonstrated or well modeled outcomes. Of course, it would be useful as a, let's call it a tool, that allows other countries to take the same fundamental idea and use it in their own settings to see what would happen with an outbreak based on just one individual, and theoretically with a little bit of modification, increasing the number of patient zeros, or patient zero to whatever number you want, the generations of the disease, and so on. Next we have archaeological evidence from South Africa and what is arguably the oldest known burial site in the world. This is interesting in that it's not a human burial site, rather it's one of our more distant ancestors, and they appear to have been small-brained relative to humans. And the argument to date has been because of their small brain, they weren't capable of exhibiting complex behavior. However, this burial site would, to a certain extent, counter that argument by demonstrating that, well, they did more than just survive, eat, poop, and breed. They were able to actually have a sort of cemetery. Although it isn't exactly caveman levels of development, it's certainly far more than the 4 F's of biology: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction. Although these findings are certainly a challenge to the concept that humans relatively evolved in a somewhat linear line with a few branches that have died off, the researcher who is responsible for this is known to be controversial, and that does raise some questions, at least initially, about the findings. So until they've been, let's say, more substantially investigated and certainly far better published as far as the findings within the burial site go, the initial claims should be taken with a lot of salt. More so than anything because these results are published in preprint servers and therefore do raise questions about the methods, the findings, and so on until peer review goes through and thoroughly examines what's being claimed. The next bit of research might be considered somewhat more disconcerting, and that is starfish are fundamentally bodiless heads, basically a dullahan but without the body. The issue here is that there is the somewhat arguably sadistic practice of cutting off one of the starfish limbs and seeing it grow back. This would, if the analogy is accurate, mean that you are cutting off something like, say, their ears or nose and watching it grow back. Yeah. This leads us to the findings themselves, and, well, starfish are often described as being brainless. That is, in terms of they have no centralized brain like the human does. Rather, their brain is spread out across their body, basically in small clusters of nodes. The starfish responds to the environment based on this and is able to then, well, feed itself accordingly and respond to various threats that it perceives. The way the researchers came to their conclusion is, in some ways, relatively straightforward. What they did was fluorescence in situ hybridization, although possibly not fluorescence, but the idea is the same. They genetically modified the starfish so that when the DNA and RNA was translated and the various products were expressed, there would be a marker attached to this. And so when they took slices of the starfish and they were able to then shine a light on it and get images, they could establish where various genes were being expressed. The reason they did this was to identify whether or not the starfish had, say, a trunk like the human torso, abdomen, head, and so on. It makes sense in that respect, as the human body is relatively symmetrical on a left and right pattern, whereas the starfish is symmetrical but with 5, let's say, mirrors. And this is the key to their finding. What they found was that the distribution of the various markers across the body of the starfish would be more accurately compared to the head of something like a human. And so they believe that, well, the starfish is just one head rather than a body and head. This does raise a question about if there was a zombie outbreak among starfish, how would you destroy it, given that it seems to be able to not only recover from having parts of itself cut off, but, well, zombies are typically considered by having to destroy their head. Further to the weirdness of starfish, we have scientists working in environmental research trying to find ways to, well, recycle various things, including the key component in diapers. As mentioned initially, it's not recycling shit, which is something we've been able to do for millennia, if not more. No, this is a modern problem and it requires a modern solution. A key part of diapers is partly plastic. Well, specifically a polymer, and it's the absorbent part of the nappy itself. If you were to take the nappy and break it down to its various components, you have the outer shell, the padded lining, and the absorbent section within it. The absorbent section is what prevents urine from escaping and, to a degree, absorbs a lot of the fluid from the feces dropped into it. The problem is that the very nature of the absorbent lining is that it's meant to be difficult to break down. Otherwise it really wouldn't work very well for its purpose. And because of that, and given the contents of the nappy, they tend to be thrown in the bin and sent to landfill, and that creates a massive problem. A fairly straightforward approach to doing this would be to quite literally drop the nappy into a vat of acid, and that would certainly break it down. After all, polymers don't do well inside of acidic environments. It has to do with the nature of how polymers work and pH. However, that approach isn't exactly viable on a large scale. The solution the German and Chinese researchers found was to use UV light, and it appears that this is far more efficient than just using acid. The researchers believe that the, let's call it product of this process, can be then used as a additional ingredient in other products. For example, adhesives, or the rather disquieting idea as a thickener for water-based dyes, and the idea of having anything that was formerly full of poop used in, well, a dye is kind of disconcerting. Moving from sort of engineering news to more digital news, we have an interesting quandary raised by the Neurologica blog. Specifically, should AI be treated as a legal entity, or as, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, a subject? That is an AI similar to a human, or for that matter, a business, which is legally a person, even if in the case of a business it's not an actual human being? This is something that legal scholars have been umming and ahhing about, particularly since ChatGPT really took off, but even before then, given the, state of media, and particularly characters like, say, the Terminator, and others again, if they were, considered a being or a person, they'd have all the responsibilities that go with that. But how do you punish an AI in those terms? And to a somewhat more abstract extent, if we get to the point where you have let's call them companion robots, are they going to have the same rights as a human, and therefore the way they're being viewed now, is that going to work as well? This is where the blog post puts forward an interesting concept. That is, theoretically, at least in some US states, any corporation which is considered an entity or a person doesn't necessarily require a human to have it as their head, so to say. This means an AI could run a corporation, and in doing so, both obtain an entity in the terms of the corporation, but in and of itself be that corporation. This means that there's at least two ways now that AI could become a person, either giving AI personhood in its own right, or to the more complicated extent of having each AI as its own corporation and thereby gain personhood. The Neurologica blog goes through a number of examples where this could become quite interesting. It begins with the simple example of a self-driving car versus a car being driven by an individual, and the liability based on who's doing what and the responsibility of each party to an extent, and then goes through the development of problems from that. And it's certainly worth a read as far as, well, not just the legality of this, but what challenges may arise and some of the problems that may occur, although it certainly uses some unexpected and arguably not very good analogies. Nonetheless, it does raise the questions, and it provides some further questions, if not some answers, all about how humans arguably have the power to destroy asteroids that are coming towards Earth. This is not a case of Hollywood becoming reality, but definitely getting there. The key here is that, well, not just is the article, or more accurately, preprint article, raising possibilities, but much like the AI article or blog post from earlier, it's providing thoughtful ideas, let's call them. The challenge here is that, well, unlike some movies where we have to send humans out to asteroids to destroy them at the last possible moment, this could be done far more pragmatically by deflecting asteroids in a way that, well, prevents the harm of asteroids hitting Earth, and not necessarily Earth-destroying degrees of asteroids, but even much smaller asteroids that would result in only millions of deaths. Strangely enough, the proposal isn't actually that far off from what Starship Troopers would have us think. The expectation is that if we have a system with a rocket on standby at all times, it could be launched within a day of detecting said asteroid flying by Earth, and in doing so, intercepting it early enough would lead to fragmentation, largely missing Earth, but even if it did, given we've broken up the asteroid into small enough parts, it no longer poses a threat of, well, something large enough hitting Earth and causing such an impact as to destroy, as already mentioned, at the least impactful millions, and at the most impactful possible life on Earth. The final news item we have for you this week is, well, arguably far more optimistic than you might think at first. That is, once our star is gone and the sun has burnt itself out and died, theoretically the white dwarf remaining afterwards might yet still be able to support life. Kind of. The caveat to this is that, well, the process of going from a functional main star like ours to a white dwarf is arguably incredibly destructive. The, let's say, loss of the gas cloud around it that has been its primary source of fuel leads to tidal disruptions that will in some cases rip planets apart. This means small life-containing planets like our Earth would be utterly destroyed. However, larger planets, like say Jupiter, would be able to survive, let's say, although survive may be a tad positive or optimistic as far as describing what's going to happen. once the main star or main sequence star has finished going from the functional sun that we're used to a white dwarf, it has a much smaller habitable zone, and that's simply because the amount of heat it puts out has shrunk massively. It no longer produces energy to the same extent, and that means the band in which life could function is, well, gone to a degree. It's now tiny by comparison. However, a massive Earth-like planet, and by massive we are talking about something the size of Jupiter, it is possible that a planet within the habitable zone of a white dwarf star could, assuming that life on it has either survived or life is going to start again, could then still continue to sustain life, although, again, we are talking about a very optimistic idea here. And that's partly because the research into this by astronomers indicates that there aren't that many planets of that size to start with, so the probability of it occurring is rare, but also that, well, you need to have the planet survive the process of going from a main sequence star to a white dwarf. Not exactly a confidence-inspiring caveat. This is also why the researchers involved have clearly said, as quoted, "For these reasons, we don't consider our hypothesis in any way established with conviction," end quote. And it's pretty much for exactly the reasons stated. There's just too little known about whether or not planets of that size are common, or that planets the size of Earth are common. The probability of surviving in terms of the process of creating a white dwarf, and so on. In turn, that means that it's more along the lines of an interesting observation than a real finding in and of itself. And by real finding, we mean that something you can extrapolate out to other situations. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.